Well, as you might have imagined, we've been working on this for the past 3 years, my partner, Barb Quijada, and I. And now we'd like to show you some of the things that we've been doing. What we saw as our end product was to create awareness, because for so long, the history of people of color in this country has been hidden. And so much is embedded in our country's consciousness, that we attempted in our pursuits to expose it. And you'll hear from some of the people who participated in our project.
It started out about 3 years ago with a curriculum that's put out through the UUA and the FAWS Collective called Beloved Conversations, Meditations in Race and Ethnicity. And at the first, Beverly and another member of the congregation at that time, Amy Smith, were the leaders, and I was just a participant in that. It's 9 weeks of structured curriculum. We did that with members of the board and others of the community. I think there were about 20 of us. And then when we decided to do it again, Amy was not going to do that facilitating anymore, and Beverly asked me to be part of that. So then we did another group, again, the 9 full weeks of curriculum, deep check-in and looking at the invisible, these are the sessions that we did, the invisible footprint of racial and ethnic history, exploring the dynamic of racism and privilege, racism today, microaggressions, a congregational audit, what's in our congregation's backpack, community audit, the legacy of racism and congressional experience, toward a new identity, how can we be in the world, and collecting our wisdom and creating the future. We have been asked to do this curriculum again, and if there were enough people who wanted to do that and were willing to commit to the 9-week sessions, we'd be more than happy to do that again. At the back, there's a table with places where you can sign up for places where you're interested. We haven't set dates yet for any of these, but if you'd put your name in that square, if that's something that interests you, we'd be glad to have you do that. Jamal is going to talk a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement and the fusion of that with other movements in the country right now.
Good morning. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Barb, for allowing me to speak. Thank you, VUU, for being here today. They said that I have a short amount of time here, so I will get right to it. I live in intersecting identities which can be wrought with constant fear, tireless battles, and the defense of life. The ability to separate the moral, ethical, and spiritual parts of myself which are subject to change from the body I exist in and the characteristics which are God-given is a constant challenge with those in minority groups within minorities. Voices are often underheard and often underappreciated, with the most marginalized being in the greatest contempt. I say all this not to incite pity, distress, anger, or what people like to say the Black Lives Matter movement is, to be divisive, but to set the stage for common but uneven ground. Let me say that standing here, I recognize my privilege. I am educated, I am employed, I am able-bodied, I'm a man, and I have a voracious support system. But we stand at the precipice, at the point in history that I, as a 36-year-old black gay man, can have confusion, contempt, and frustration. On a daily basis, I am forced to take an all-or-nothing approach. Standing in all lives matter sentiment, which seems to be a cover to many Black Lives Matter voices to be docile or crazy. Often, when I hear all lives matter, it's a shut up, because you need to be grateful that you're no longer enslaved, or you're no longer living in Jim Crow, or you're no longer doing this, because my life is not treated the same way as all lives. It is not at all it is not an all or nothing. There is a long history which informs the current situation. Slavery, Jim Crow, the cocaine-fueled Negro, the crack epidemic, higher rates of incarceration, and harsher sentencing for blacks, the lasting effects of police involved in a system of inequality and injustice is real. I say all this because as though you all don't know, but to acknowledge that. On July 8th, I marched with a diverse group of people through the streets of downtown. I rallied with those who wanted justice despite Mayor Stanton's request to postpone this demonstration. There seems to be no postponing, though, of the senseless death of black lives at the hands of police officers. Before we reached the highway, a barricade of police stopped us. There was no announcement of disbursement of police, no acknowledgement of frustration, no alternative to the meaning of the protest. The crowd was met with pepper spray, canisters shot into the air, police adorned in riot gear. There was no riot, but this is how we are treated. Dallas, and this morning, Baton Rouge should have never happened. And those officers who were shot and killed and lost their lives was just as senseless as Staten Island, New York, Los Angeles, California, Victorville, California, Beaver Creek, Ohio, Ferguson, Missouri, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the list goes on. One does not condone nor negate. However, if we take a body count of how many police have lost their lives at the hands of civilians due to race, it would be significantly different. I do not see the same, I sit in spaces in which those who I look to for protection and service, including family, often belittle and kill. Being a minority with privilege, I have to stand for black rights, Latino rights, women's rights, gay rights, those who have mental health conditions, immigrant rights, homeless individuals, people who are differently abled, first responders, including the police, who I pay taxes for and inform their pension structure. However, I do not see the same considerations when my life is threatened and treated as being different no matter what. There seems to be no room for conversations which include both sides. If we hope to avoid pointless killings, discrimination, and stigma, there need to be more conversations, collaboration, and action like Beloved Conversations. Thank you, VUU, for allowing the platform for these things. Police should be kept in check by other police. Body cameras should absolutely be enforced as long as they remain functional. And then constant forums in which we come together as a community, talk to the police as well as other community members, and have no retaliation. Additional training. This includes same-sex domestic violence and the investigations which go cold for my transgendered brothers and sisters who are beaten and killed every week. There is no simple solution, but a multiple, aggressive approach for both police and civilian is needed. Just like there is no one root cause, there's no one root solution. So I ask you all to ease the burden by first acknowledging that everyone is not treated equally. Have conversations with your relatives, friends, co-workers, and who have discriminatory speech, who don't see. Show up for you like I will. Show up for me like I will show up for you. Attend groups and classes like Beloved Conversations. Attend rallies, marches, walks. Fight for causes and vote for change. Solidarity is a difficult goal to achieve, but it must be one that we all see as possible, as a solution to the problems we face. As we heard, and I thought this was quite ironic, Ella's song that we heard by Sweet Honey in the Rock, until the killing of black men, black mother sons is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's won. Thank you.
In the monthly women's group meeting at VUU, things are a little calmer. We don't usually carry signs and protest. But we had some wonderful, wonderful conversations over the last 2 years. The women's group invited Beverly to come and speak. She comes often just as a member of the group, but to actually speak to her experience. And then they asked her to come back. And then they asked Aletha Barrett to come, and Roz Hawkins to come and to speak to their experience as black women in the society. And the conversations got deeper and deeper. And I think the thing that moved me the most was when people who began saying, "But I don't see color, I see everybody as the same," began to say, "I do see color. We aren't all the same. Your experience has been different than mine. Thank you for telling your story. Let's share stories." So that's another piece of the work that we've been doing here. Another has been, I think I'm on the right one, Stephanie, now, is that right? Okay. Some work where we were invited to come out into the community and do some work at one of the local high schools. And Stephanie Sapatke is going to tell you about that.
Please forgive me, I'm not used to standing behind a microphone. However, in the last 2 years, I found it very difficult to stay silent, and I find myself in more and more situations that put me behind a microphone. As a teacher at Highland High, I have witnessed various groups of students alienated, isolated, and bullied. I do not believe that most of this bullying comes from cruel intent, but from cultural misunderstandings. So, after a series of very culturally insensitive spirit days, supervised by adults on our campus, a group of students and I formed a club called SPARK, Students Promoting Attitudes of Respect and Kindness. SPARK Club sponsored many events on our campus. We hosted a cultural festival to celebrate our similarities and our uniqueness. We celebrated Peace One Day, Human Rights Day, and Mix It Up Day. But the most important event that the students organized was a speaker series in which several community groups, including our own Black Lives Matter, came during lunch hours to campus. Students gave up their lunchtime to hear Arizona Humanities talk about undocumented students, to see Arizona Institute for Civil Dialogue show us how to speak to one another when we disagree, and to witness Barbara and Beverly from Black Lives Matter create a welcoming and open space for a candid discussion about race relations on our campus and in our community. It was a tremendous opportunity for the students to see two people with very different life experiences come together and work toward a common goal and to understand each other through the process. I must admit, I took a little pleasure in watching my students' faces as they entered the room, and their stereotypes were shattered in seeing these two elegant, sophisticated ladies instead of the angry, militant people they expected. It was amazing to see so many of my students speak their own voices and their own opinions about their own personal experiences with race on our campus and in our community, perhaps for the first time in a public setting. Many of them expressed afterward how grateful they were to start the discussion. In this time of growing polarization, it is truly important to teach our young people to speak to each other, to listen to one another, to understand one another, and to respect one another. That is why Beverly and Barbara's and our congregation's Black Lives Matter group is so vital. It shows young people that we do need to continue the conversation, that we can show care and concern with respect for each other. I am so grateful to Barbara and Beverly and to this congregation. I hope they continue their work to this end, and I am so blessed to have this community as a resource and an inspiration in my teaching and my life. May we continue to stand on the side of love together. Thank you.
I'd like to add one thing to that wonderful day that we spent at Stephanie's school. There was a biracial young lady in the audience, and she told a story about going to the doctor's office with her dad, who's black. She said when they walked into the office, there was one person sitting there, a white woman, and she looked up, saw her father, and immediately clutched her purse to her heart. And the young lady said, well, I guess she did that. She looked a little frightened of my dad. My dad's kind of big, and maybe he's really scary looking. So I said, so what's scary about your dad? She said, his eyes. I said, does anybody else in here have an experience with dad eyes? And all the kids were going, uh-huh. Yeah. So they met in common ground. I said, could it be that it was just the dad, and maybe, you don't need to think of him as being threatening and frightening anymore? And that was a wonderful takeaway for me. I'd like to have you listen to next someone who was not in our film group, but who has a poignant message to give to you. One of the films that we showed was Fruitvale Station. It was about a young man who, with his group of friends, were going to celebrate the fireworks. And they were on a train, and a fight broke out, which was provoked by a white person. However, the police didn't see it that way, and they dragged all of the black guys who were together as a group off the train, and eventually one of the young men was killed. Killed as he was sitting on the floor, handcuffed. So now I'd like you to have Kathy tell her story. Because there was a woman in the group who said, well, my son is a police officer, and he's a good man, and we're afraid of these people. Can't they wait? Can't they be a little bit more patient? And the response of someone in the group was, and this person was black, she said, I know that not all policemen are bad, because I know that not all black people are good. However, I've got to tell my son something to keep him safe, and that's what I need to do. And now I'd like Kathy to speak with you.
I'll make the same joke that Patrick did, but at least I'll take my shoes off. Then I won't be so tall. Growing up, I learned in school about racism and bigotry in my history class. I was taught that things happened in the American South, but through the abolishment of slavery with Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement, we had done away with those issues, and our country had become better and stronger. Black Americans were fully integrated into American life, pursuing the American dream, and we lived in a post-racial world. And why wouldn't I believe what I taught, or what I was taught? I sang and danced in my bedroom to Whitney Houston and Janet Jackson and Mariah Carey. At school dances, Prince and Michael Jackson begged us to come on the dance floor, even though we were on the sidelines. So awkward. Michael Jordan flying through the air with his basketball hung on my brother's wall. Every Thursday night at 7 o'clock, our family sat down and laughed with Dr. Huxtable's family. And I knew every word to the song from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and I could probably still recite it now. And some of you can too. It's very catchy. But I laughed at Chris Rock, Eddie Murphy, Dave Chappelle, and Will Smith and Denzel Washington were the America's box office kings. My exposure to racial discrimination was very limited. But then again, I grew up in a small Mormon, all-white community in Rexburg, Idaho, and I went to all predominantly white Brigham Young University. There were some people of color. They were on the football team, but that was it. But when I went to graduate school in New York City, my reality changed. In the first weeks of orientation at the Columbia School of Social Work, they had all the new students participate in a workshop on diversity, and they had us physically line up according to privilege. And privilege had to do with class and race. And I was at the top of the line of privilege. And I was horrified. I was embarrassed. I was uncomfortable. I went back to my apartment and cried, literally cried, and said to my classmate, but I'm not privileged. I'm not biased. I can't, I don't think that way. How can I be responsible for the sins of my white forefathers? I'm a Democrat, for heaven's sakes, But my view started to change when I started working in an elementary school as a social work intern in the black neighborhood of Crown Heights, Brooklyn. And I saw firsthand modern-day segregation and racial disparities. Underfunded programs, policed hallways, overcrowded classrooms. It was far different than my elementary school education. And I started to recognize that, there still is some racial injustice in this world. When I started dating my husband, Carl, which he's in the baby's room with the 2 babies, you might have seen him, he's a black man, my assumptions were challenged again, and because I was surprised when he admitted to me that he had the talk from his grandfather. It had not crossed my mind that Carl, who grew up in suburban Columbus, who went to private prep school, Ivy League educated, medical student at Columbia, ever had to worry about racism or police brutality. I'd assumed that due to his socioeconomic advances, that somehow that reduced his risk or saved him from exposure to racism. But not until then did it occur to me that it exists in all races, all classes, and at all levels. And over the years, he's shared with me things that have come up in regards to his peers or his professors, even his patients, and in regards to his race. Before we got married, I found myself unprepared for some of the comments regarding our future children and where would they culturally fit in. And I brushed off comments from my smug New York friends that said, you can't raise your children outside of New York because they're mixed. This middle America just won't have that. But now, 14 years after becoming a couple and 3 wonderful kids later, our children have skin very similar in tone to their father. And at times, I feel like people assume that I'm the one that's adopted or I'm the second wife. Because if one of these things don't look like the other, it's me. But if you line the 5 of us up according to privilege, I'm still at the top end of that line. I'm still and I'm outraged for much different reasons than I was 15 years ago. But I realized that bias still exists, that racism is real, and they don't just vanish due to the work done by Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Like every mother, I don't want to see my children disadvantaged or discriminated against. And like any mother, I want my children to come home safe and sound at the end of every day. But as the mother of black children, I just don't get to worry about car accidents, drunk driving, or school bullies. I have to worry about my son being shot in the park like Tamir Rice, or being assaulted and killed for wearing a hoodie like Trayvon Martin. We know that someday we will have to give our talk to the children. Not because the police or our neighbors are bad, but because they're human. These fears and discussions that my upbringing did not prepare me for any of these types of issues. And luckily, Carl and his family have been very patient and open with me about race, especially now that we have children. And over the years, these discussions have gotten easier, and I've gotten more comfortable, and I'm very thankful for these honest conversations. I have found that black Americans, like a lot of minorities, are very comfortable talking about race, but we white Americans are not. In my experience, I believe if we really want change in our current climate, we have to get out of denial. If we're going to be good people, we first have to be real people. We've got to look deep within ourselves and be honest about our fears, honest about the advantages and disadvantages that each of us face, and to be honest in our conversation with our families and friends. We must consciously expand our circle to include more than just one friend who has a different color of skin than us. And because when we expand our circle of family and friends to include those that are different than us, we make connections and we gain empathy. We stop being bystanders and we start being advocates and allies. And we've got to speak up. When we see something, we have to say something, even to the ones we love. We have to listen to conversations around the table, because do you know who also is at the table? Our kids. And the children are listening to what we say, and that's why these biases are not dying. We've got to chime in and say, Mom, we don't call people that anymore. Or, Uncle, it isn't true that he deserved that. No one deserves that. We're going to have to get uncomfortable before we can get comfortable. And it's not going to be perfect. But it's not about perfection. It's about connection.
So the most visible symbol here at VUU of our activity to the neighborhood has been the banner that we've hung out in front. The first one was hung, I went back and thought, really? October 25th was the first hanging. A lot of us signed it, lots of you signed it, and we had a very brief dedication ceremony and put it up. November 5th, it was vandalized with paper signs. This sounds so gentle now. With paper signs taped over it and around the campus that said, "All Lives Matter." We put up another one. It was spray painted, "All Lives Matter." No, that was on November 9th. On November 22nd, the banner was cut down and stolen. On November 25th, Arizona Central did a story about it. We put up a new sign. We had TV coverage. On November 27th, 2 days later, that new one was spray painted with "all." December 22nd or 26th, the second banner was gone. The third one we put up had a statement that's across it that says, "Of course we affirm that all lives matter, but we proclaim Black Lives Matter because so often in our society they are treated as if they do not." January 17th, and during that one, we had a huge ceremony. We had people from all over the valley, interfaith congregation. We had prayers. The Presbyterians were here. The Islamic and Sikhs were here. The Lakota woman gave a blessing. We were on TV. Everybody signed it. It was a lovely ceremony on the 17th. On the 30th of January, it was defaced again. But we had a Facebook message from neighbors thanking us for putting the banner up and for not giving up. 3 and 4 were stolen. They've been paid for by other congregations who've been helping us out. On June 8th, the 5th banner was stolen, and we put another one up. And on July 8th, the 6th one was stolen, and with the work of a member of the congregation, Gary Cantley, and the Chandler police who've been cooperating with all along, the person who stole it was caught. He was arrested, but Reverend Andy and others in the group decided not to press charges. The young man who stole the banner will be coming to services in the fall, and I thought we were supposed to put another one up yesterday. It's not up. I hope it hasn't already been stolen. I don't know the story yet. We'll find out afterwards. Thank you for your support of that visible sign of the work that VUU is doing here in Chandler. And next, Willa's going to tell us a little bit about a connection we have with the Chandler police.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Oops, that's too much. Earlier this month, Bev and Barb approached me about just coming up and sharing some thoughts about a meeting that several of us attended in May between the Chandler Police Department and the East Valley NAACP. This is a quarterly meeting between these two organizations. And I'm not real comfortable about being up here, but I mean, you don't say no to Bev and Barb. So, okay, so I thought, okay, how easy can this be? How hard can it be? Okay, so there's only two things I need to tell you, right? The first one is that 14 of our congregation showed up, and we talked about topics such as the appropriate use of force, police transparency, de-escalation of potentially violent situations, police training, and building relationships. So that's all I really needed to say, right? 30 seconds, I'd be up here, I'd be gone. Great. And then July 5th happened, and Anton Sterling, a black man, was killed by a police officer. And then on July 6th, I'm sorry, I'm very nervous up here. Philando Castile, a black man, was also killed by a police officer. And on July 7th, 5 police officers were killed and 9 more were injured. Like much of the country, I was devastated as these events only seem to underscore the dialogue of hatred that we are seeing on a daily basis during this political season. I realized that the real story that I wanted to talk about today was not about attending this meeting between the Chandler Police and the NAACP, but about why attending these types of meetings are important and how I believe it contributes to our support as a spiritual community for BLM, for Black Lives Matter, and our ongoing racial justice work. Reverend Andy began forging a relationship with the Chandler Police during the numerous times that we had our banners stolen. He got to know the police officers, and they got to know us and our values. They invited him to come and bring interested congregation members to their quarterly meeting on May 10th. The primary topic of discussion for the evening was how to build trust and legitimacy between the community and police. There were helpful dialogues between attendees and police officers, including the chief of police, who was in attendance. However, I suspected then that there was another conversation going on behind these words, a subtext, if you will. I couldn't help but wonder if the black members of this committee were asking themselves, are these police really listening to us, and do they really understand our concerns? And I also wondered if the police were thinking, don't people understand how hard it is to be a police officer, and we're really trying to do good? Since then, I've heard several people say over the last few weeks that real change within the police culture needs to come from within, from police working with other police to demand that officers are held accountable for their actions. Just as it is often more effective for a white person to explain white privilege to another white person, I believe police culture will only begin to change as police officers begin to have the hard discussions with other police officers. By our building positive personal relationships between our community members and individual police, we provide support for these police to begin the police-to-police conversations that are important for this violence to end. Trevor Noah, who is Jon Stewart's replacement, well, nobody can actually replace Jon Stewart, on The Daily Show, is a black man from South Africa. And on his show on July 7th, he said, if you're pro-Black Lives Matter, you're assumed to be anti-police. And if you're pro-police, then you surely hate black people. It seems like it's pro-cop and anti-black, or pro-black and anti-cop, when in reality, you should be pro-cop and pro-black, which is what we should all be. It should be what we're aiming for. I believe that attending such meetings as this meeting between the NAACP and Chandler Police allows us to show our support for both Black Lives Matter and for our police officers, and to encourage dialogue and hopefully be part of a larger productive conversation on creating a more just world where a black man or woman doesn't have to fear for their life when they get pulled over at a stop traffic stop for a broken tail light.
So by now you must be wondering, where is this place where all this good stuff is going to happen? And is it really all in the imagination of the people sitting here? Well, my grandmother gave me a wonderful gift, and that was the gift of optimism. And I'd like to share with you my personal experience of being in paradise in New York City. I was the assistant principal of a school called the Louis Armstrong Middle School in East Elmhurst, Queens. If anybody knows, it's one of the districts. Well, this particular school was a new school, and it was scheduled to be an all-black school. But the activists in the community took the Board of Education to court, and the court decided that this school should be racially, intellectually, and culturally balanced. And that's what happened. It was one of the greatest times of my life. One of my only regrets was that I was not young enough to be one of the students, because it was amazing. We worked with Queens College, which means that we had student teachers and professors who would come back and forth to the school to work with the students. We also had access to Louis Armstrong's home and his papers. Now, since this part of Queens is the jazz area, there were lots of old jazz musicians who would come in and do workshops with the kids. And on several occasions, the kids went to New Orleans to play in the Jazz and Heritage Festival. And I do have pictures. They were great. The language classes went to Spain, went to France. We had connections with Lincoln Center and the Public Theater, so kids had that kind of outlet too. I'm telling you, this was really an awesome place. We had career days, we had all sorts of experts come in to tell the children what the possibilities were for them when they grew up. The scores, we were among the top 10 schools in New York City, and there was no extra money. We did it on our own. Of course, when we tried to influence other schools, they would say, you're just getting special service from people, and that's why all of this is wonderful. We go, come see, we're really just working this game. We're really just trying very hard. But you know how people are. However, people from around the country would call in and come and visit to see what we were doing that was creating this kind of success. Well, long story short, over 90% of our kids graduated from high school, and many were accepted in prestigious schools, Georgetown, schools in California. I mean, it was a wonderful experience. But here is something that I found so incredible. With that incredible mix, I had a young man who was white and who's from an area in Brooklyn, in the edge of Brooklyn and Queens, that was really, really adamantly racist. So he came into my office and he said, we're really having trouble with this guy who keeps taking our ball away when we're out there trying to play handball before school starts. So I said, okay, I'll look into it. So I called the young man into my office and I said, so what's the deal here? He said, well, I keep taking the ball because there's a guy who's on my bus who comes to school with us every day, and he said he wants to grab the ball so he can really start a rumble out there in the schoolyard. So I figure if I take the ball and bounce it around a couple of times and just then toss it back, then that'll take care of the situation. And of course it did. So I had the two boys meet in my office, dyad position, knee to knee, eye contact, and all that sort of stuff. And I had them tell each other their stories. And it was like they each took this deep breath. Wow, I didn't know that's what you were doing. Yeah, man, we didn't want to start any stuff. This is a good school. We like being here. We don't want any kind of trouble. And over time, these two guys became very, very good buddies. And as a matter of fact, the young white guy wrote a song for our house because he was just so proud to be there. So can this happen? Absolutely. If it can happen in this little place in New York City, it can certainly happen here. And we want to encourage you to be part of the group that takes the action that makes it happen.